Hello viewers, this is CS Academy once again, and today we are having a continuation of our last topic, which we have effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and quantity. We took 6 cases before now, and we're hoping to have 10 cases running after now. Stay tuned, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Okay, so as we proceed, we're going to start with case number 7, still under effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and quantity. For case number 7, the instruction we are to obey is the one that says increase in supply only, which is just the opposite of case number 1, where we have increase in demand only. Now, increase in supply only also means increase in supply without a change in demand. Don't forget the equilibrium point. So bring back this equilibrium point, re-establish it, and then we can move on from there to obey that instruction. So I have my price, and then my quantity in units. This is the supply, this is the demand curve. D1, D1, S1, S1. At the point of interaction, we have the equilibrium point 1, and we trace it to the price line. It gives us equilibrium price 1. Quantity, it gives us equilibrium quantity 1. And then we go into the instruction. The instruction says increase in supply only. Increase in supply is a rightward shift of the supply curve. And then that brings us to something like this. If we have a shift in supply to signify increase, then it has to be a rightward shift. At S2 and D1, because we do not have a new demand curve, the new equilibrium point will be at the point where the new supply curve interacts with the old demand curve. That gives us equilibrium point 2. You trace it to the price line, it gives equilibrium price 2. Trace it to the quantity line, it gives you equilibrium quantity 2. When we look at the interaction going on between price, it shows that we have a decrease in equilibrium price, because equilibrium price 1 is above and then equilibrium price 2 is below. For quantity, we're having an increase in equilibrium quantity. Looking at QE1 and QE2, you can see it's an outward shift. That brings us to our effect. The first effect from what we can see, considering the price aspect of this, we have equilibrium price decreased. So we can say there is a decrease. The effect of this will be a decrease in equilibrium price, and then an increase in equilibrium quantity. Increase in equilibrium quantity. So for any question where the examiner says an increase in supply only will lead to dash, the correct answer from the option will be any option that can accommodate or will accommodate a decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. And once you pick that, we're good to go. Looking at the next case, we have case number 8. And case number 8 is just the opposite of case number 7. So in this case, we just signify a decrease in supply only. A decrease in supply is simply the leftward shift of the supply curve. But if we must have it well explained, or probably without getting confused, let's take the diagram all over again. So I'm considering decrease in supply only. This time in my instruction, I have my price, my quantity, price in naira, quantity in units again. Re-establish the equilibrium point. This is for D1, and this is for S1, S1. The point of intersection gives us our equilibrium point. Trace it to the price axis, you have equilibrium price 1 and then equilibrium quantity 1 on the quantity line. The instruction says decrease in supply only. Decrease in supply only is a leftward shift of the supply curve. So we're going this way and then we introduce something else. So S2, S2, and that shows that the new supply curve and the old demand curve, in the absence of a new demand curve, gives us, or we reproduce or produce the new equilibrium point. The new equilibrium point can be traced to the price line, which gives us the new equilibrium price. We trace it to the quantity line, it gives us equilibrium quantity 2. What do we have here? What can we see? The interaction here shows that there is an increase in equilibrium price and then there is a decrease in equilibrium quantity. If I have to put this in effect, we just need to change the first one. The first effect here is for price and it shows increase from what we have. On the lower part, this has to change to decrease for it to be in line with the interaction going on here. So whenever an examiner puts up a question that says a decrease in supply without a change in demand, the correct option that will go is any option in the question that accommodates increase in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. And once you're able to notify that, make it your answer, you're good to go. Now the next line of cases that we're going to have, we'll call them special cases. We have 8 treated, we have 8 more to go. In this other 8, we need students who are going to actually study this to be more technical, because we're not looking at the regular demand and supply curves. We start with a constant kind of demand curve where we consider perfectly inelastic demand curve, and then we watch supply increase and also decrease. We do a switch to perfectly elastic and then watch supply increase and decrease. We repeat the same thing from the supply angle and then we have 8 more cases, which brings it to an end. Case number 9 to 16, they are considered as special cases because the kind of demand curves and supply curves we are going to use. One will be kept constant and the other one will be allowed to move. And then we switch lane and still do the same adjustment. So I want to take this out and also state before I begin to draw the diagram that these cases are special because they are not the regular equilibrium that we know. So I'm going to add special cases to what we're doing now. The instruction we are to obey in this case. Case number 9, as we mentioned earlier, we have been able to reproduce a new demand curve that we're going to be using. This kind of demand curve is not unitary, and as I will say, they are not regular cases, they are called special cases. This kind of demand curve is a perfectly inelastic demand curve, because you can see that prices can change and then quantity demanded won't change. But that's not what we're majoring on. We're coming with the instruction that says perfectly inelastic demand and an increase in supply. An increase in supply. So let's establish that demand curve. That's our origin. And then we'll obey the instruction. Price in Naira still necessary. And then quantity is always in units. So we have a demand curve showing perfectly inelastic demand. This is our supply curve, S1, D1, S1. This point is our first equilibrium point. And then this is equilibrium price 1. This is equilibrium quantity 1. When we have S1, and we are to obey this instruction, this is perfectly inelastic demand. And then they said, and an increase in supply. Increase in supply like we have in the first, in the previous lecture shows, or we show an increase. We show a rightward shift of the supply curve. A rightward shift of the supply curve will be represented with something like this, which produces S2. At S2, we check the point of interaction between the new supply curve and the old demand curve. And then we have E2, trace it to the price line. We have PE2, and then we trace this to the quantity line. We have QE2, which happens to be on the same line with the old equilibrium quantity. And that means equilibrium quantity in this case will remain constant, while equilibrium price will do what? Fall. So this will be interpreted in our effect as what? A decrease in equilibrium price. A decrease in equilibrium price and a constant equilibrium quantity. So equilibrium quantity, constant equilibrium quantity. So for any question where the examiner says with a perfectly inelastic demand curve, an increase in supply will lead to dash. The option from the question which is going to be perfectly correct is the one that has decrease in equilibrium price and a constant equilibrium quantity. And once you take that as your answer, then you're good to go. All right. The next case is case number 10. And case number 10, we're just doing something slightly opposite. We have done perfectly elastic demand and an increase in supply. We just need to change this to decrease and then obey the instruction on the diagram. Decrease in supply. Let's take this out so that we don't get confused. Decrease in supply from a perfectly inelastic demand nature. This is a supply curve, S1, S1, D1, D1. This is equilibrium point 1. We trace it to the price axis. It gives us equilibrium price 1. Okay. This is what we have instead. So it's D1 because it has to be perfectly inelastic. And then we have a supply curve this way, which gives us S1, S1. So this is the equilibrium point, and we trace it to the price axis. It gives us this. Quantity axis, it gives us this. So if you have an equilibrium position like this, I want to obey this instruction. This is actually what we have: perfectly inelastic demand and a decrease in supply were to introduce a decrease in supply into this diagram, a decrease in supply is always a shift to the what? Left. And that means this is the kind of diagram we're going to have. S2, S2. With this new supply curve, our new equilibrium point will be E2, which is the point where the new supply curve and the old demand curve intersect. You trace it to the price axis, you have PE2, which is equilibrium price 2, and then trace it to the quantity axis, and then you have equilibrium quantity 2. This shows that equilibrium quantity still remains constant while equilibrium price increases. And then for our effect, all we need to do is just transform what is here into the effect from what you can see in that interaction, or probably in that adjustment. You can see that equilibrium price is increasing, and then we can have increase in equilibrium price and then constant equilibrium quantity. So this is the only thing that changes at the end of the day. So for any question where the examiner says, with a perfectly inelastic demand curve, a decrease in supply will lead to what? The correct option is the one that will accommodate increase in equilibrium price and a constant equilibrium quantity, just the same way the diagram, displays. The next one is case number 11. And case number 11, we have to switch our demand curve. Our demand curve takes another shape, and that is perfectly elastic demand. And then we bring in whatever instruction we want supply to take. So case number 11, perfectly elastic demand. Let's consider an increase in supply. An increase in supply, we can always go back and take the diagram again so that we don't get confused. Don't forget, it's still part of the special cases. And I will have a demand curve that's established in this form, and I will have a supply curve S1, S1. This is the equilibrium point. Trace it to the price axis, trace it to the quantity axis. And this is what we have, QE1, PE1. Price in Naira and quantity in unit. At this equilibrium point, 1, we can obey this instruction which says perfectly elastic demand, yes, and an increase in supply. Increase in supply is always a shift to the left. And then this is what we can have. S2, S2. This new position from the interaction between the new supply curve and the old demand curve gives us the new equilibrium point. So equilibrium point 2, from what we have here, is established from the new supply curve and the old demand curve. And I will trace it to the quantity axis, trace it to the price axis. You can see that equilibrium price 2 and equilibrium price 1, they are at the same spots. So equilibrium price 2 stays here. This shows that equilibrium price will remain constant while there is an increase in equilibrium quantity. We can transform this into the effect, but this has to give, we need a little adjustment. A little adjustment in the sense that we need to realize that the constant position have changed from quantity to price. So we can say constant equilibrium price. 2, effect number 2, we have an increase in equilibrium quantity. And anytime an examiner puts up a question like, with a perfectly elastic demand curve, an increase in supply will lead to dash. The option that will be correct for any students in the exam hall is the one that has constant equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. And once you take that, you're good to go. That leads us to case number 12. For case number 12, what we need to adjust is just increase to decrease for the supply. So perfectly elastic demand and a decrease in supply. We can take the diagram again so that we don't get confused. I have and then establish the demand curve D1, and I will have the original supply case E1. For E1, this is equilibrium price 1. We trace it to the quantity axis, gives equilibrium quantity 1. We have S1, S1. What do we have here? The equilibrium points from origin. The examiner says we should obey this instruction that says perfectly elastic demand and a decrease in supply. Decrease in supply is always shift to the left. And we have to decrease supply to the left, we have S2, S2. So at S2, S2, we have a new equilibrium point which is established from the new supply curve and the old demand curve. You trace it to the quantity axis. You have QE2, trace it to the price axis, you have PE2. It shows that price will remain constant, while equilibrium price will remain constant, while equilibrium quantity will move backward. That shows a decrease. And then we can have a repetition, but with a little adjustment. So why this one still remains constant, which is constant equilibrium price from the equilibrium price point of view, it still remains constant, but equilibrium quantity will decrease, which is revealed from the sign of the arrow. So if any question comes like, with a perfectly elastic demand curve, a decrease in supply will lead to dash. The option that will be correct is any option that can accommodate constant equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. We move to case number 13. At case number 13, we switch to the supply angle. So instead of having perfectly inelastic demand, this will take supply. So perfectly inelastic supply. Let's represent that here by, this is what perfectly inelastic supply looks like. And then we'll go back to the diagram and start all over again so that we don't get confused. So perfectly inelastic supply is a supply curve where price changes without a change in quantity demanded. What do we have? We have perfectly inelastic supply. So we'll bring it back from what we have, the S1. The demand curve for D1 will go like this, and then we have the first equilibrium point. We'll trace it to the price axis. We have the first equilibrium price, bring it to the quantity axis. It gives you equilibrium quantity 1. And then what we have to do from here is obey the instruction we have above. Perfectly elastic supply, yes, and a decrease in supply. Okay, this is demand, rather, not supply. Both of them cannot be supply. So we're having a perfectly inelastic supply and a decrease in demand. Well, I would have preferred we consider an increase first so that we can follow the trend that we have always, followed from the origin. So let's go with an increase instead. An increase in demand. That's a good idea. Increase in demand, like we have in supply, is also a rightward shift of the demand curve. So this is what we should have, D2, D2. From D2, D2, we can establish a new equilibrium point 2, which is the combination of the new demand curve and the old supply curve. We trace this to the price axis, and then we have equilibrium price 2. Equilibrium price 2, we trace it to the quantity axis also. We have equilibrium quantity 2. You can see that this is constant, while this represents or reveals an increase in equilibrium price. This will take another switch because we have equilibrium price is the one increasing while equilibrium quantity remains constant. So we can bring this other way. Increase in equilibrium price, and then we have constant equilibrium quantity. That's the effect that we have from the diagram, which is reflecting here. So if the examiner wants you to find an answer to a question that says, with a perfectly inelastic supply, an increase in demand will lead to dash. The correct answer is the one that accommodates increase in equilibrium price, and a constant equilibrium quantity. And then we move to case number 14. For case number 14, we just do the opposite. We still maintain perfectly elastic supply, but we can take decrease now. So it is perfectly inelastic supply with a decrease in demand. A decrease in demand that requires that we take the diagram all over again. Let's not forget that we're dealing with special cases. So the supply curve has to be this way, S1. From S1, we take a demand curve, D1, D1. We have equilibrium point 1, and then it gives us equilibrium price 1. We trace it to quantity, it gives us equilibrium quantity 1. If I have to obey this instruction, which says, consider a perfectly inelastic supply curve and a decrease in demand. A decrease in demand is a shift of the demand curve to the left. And if this has to shift to the left, then it can reproduce something of this nature. D2, D2. What do we have? This will be our new equilibrium point, which is E2. Why? Because that's where the new demand curve and the old supply curve meet. Since we do not have a new supply curve, we trace it to the price axis. It gives us this equilibrium price, which shows decrease. And then we trace it to the price, the quantity axis. It gives us another equilibrium quantity, which is also on the line of the first one, showing that it remained constant. So what's going to happen is just an adjustment in the effect. This shows decrease in equilibrium price, and then equilibrium quantity remains constant. So it looks like we don't really have much to do when we get to special cases in terms of effect and what? Interpretation. Case number 15. Case number 15, we will need to readjust our supply curve to the perfectly elastic nature. The perfectly elastic nature of the supply curve will lead us to drawing a new diagram. And that new diagram for case number 15 is going to have perfectly elastic instead of inelastic. Perfectly elastic supply. And let's consider an increase first. An increase in demand. We have this and we have that. So we can take perfect elastic supply, which is this, and then we have the demand curve D1, that gives us the first equilibrium point. The first equilibrium point is from the interaction between the two curves, supply and demand. We have our equilibrium price here, 1, and then our equilibrium quantity. If we trace it downward, we trace it to quantity, it gives us 1, and then E1 stays above. The examiner says we should obey the instruction of a perfect elastic supply and an increase in demand. An increase in demand is a rightward shift of the demand curve, which gives us D2 in this form. And if you compare the interaction between the new demand curve and the old supply curve, because we do not have a new demand, a new supply curve, what we are going to have is E2. And E2 traced to the quantity axis, we have QE2, trace it to the price axis, we have the same spot. PE2, or equilibrium price 2, is on the same spot with equilibrium price 1. And then for looking at this being a price line and a quantity line, although we might have skipped that for a while, but don't forget this is a quantity region. From what we can see here, we can see that equilibrium price remained constant, and that's going to make our effect change. Constant equilibrium, so not really something different, but we just need to know when and how to introduce these effects correctly. What's happening to our quantity equilibrium? We can see the equilibrium quantity from 1 to 2. It shows an increase. So we can establish increase in equilibrium. So we're moving on to case number 16. For case number 16, we only need to put up a little adjustment on what we had in case number 15. So case number 15 to case number 16, we're going to have perfectly elastic supply and a decrease in demand. Let's take the whole diagram out so that we don't get confused. So with the same trend, no big difference, we'll take the price line in Naira, and I'll take the quantity in units. Perfectly elastic supply. And then we have the original demand curve, D1, and then the examiner says, obey the instruction of a decrease in demand here. A decrease in demand is a leftward shift of the demand curve. Don't forget, this is our equilibrium price 1, and then we trace to the quantity line, gives us equilibrium quantity 1, which establishes our first equilibrium point. And then when we have a shift showing a decrease in demand, this is what it's going to look like. And that produces D2 for us, the second point of interaction, which is the point where the new demand curve and the old supply curve meet. happens to be our second equilibrium point. You trace it to the price axis, you discover that the second equilibrium price is the same spot or point with the first equilibrium price. We trace it to the quantity line. We have second equilibrium quantity showing a decrease in equilibrium quantity. Without wasting time, we move to the effect aspect, and we still have constant equilibrium price because this doesn't change. And then we have a decrease in equilibrium quantity. And once you have a question in this line, an option which will be correct will be that option that has constant equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. And that brings us to the end of the 16 cases of effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and quantity. All right. Considering a question from UTME, which is also known as JAMB, 2011 question 10 on this same topic. We have a question that says, if demand increases without a change in supply, equilibrium price and quantity will do what? The options are here. But before we go to the options, let me remind you that this is case number 1 from the cases we took. And case number 1 says increase in demand only. This is what the diagram looks like. And then we had our price line, or price in Naira, and then quantity in units. Because you have 45 seconds per question, there are ways which examiners, students can actually get this without having to put up the diagram. If you have to trace it from your specialist point of view, you realize that an increase in demand is going to drag your supply curve upward, increasing your equilibrium price and increasing your equilibrium quantity. So I know the answer is increase in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. But how do we prove that? Let's show it from the diagram. This is the original point. We have first supply, first demand, first supply, first demand. Equilibrium point 1, and then we have equilibrium price 1, equilibrium quantity 1. We increase demand without anything happening to supply. That increase shows a rightward shift of the demand curve. That's D2, D2. From D2, D2, we establish a new equilibrium point, which is from the old supply curve and the new demand curve. We trace it to the price axis and trace it to the quantity axis. We have new equilibrium price and then new equilibrium quantity. So if you look at what's happening here interaction-wise, you can see that this increases and this also does what? Increases. Looking at that adjustment, the best answer is the one that says that the two of them has what? An increase. And that's option D. So remain unchanged can be your answer because you can see there's an adjustment. Shift inward is not even a consideration because the effect is not always expressed. It's never expressed in the form of shifts. So this can't go. This will not also go. Fall is the opposite of rise. Fall has its own case, which is case number 2. But for case number 1, which is the same as the question we have on the board, our best answer and the only correct answer is an increase, which is also known as rise, for both equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So another question we can consider is the one from UTME 2009, question 15, which says a decrease in supply without a corresponding change in demand will lead to, no thinking is required. This is case number 2, and its opposite is the opposite of increase in demand only. So this is increase in supply only. And that's going to just give us an adjustment of the supply curve. If this is S1, S1, D1, D1, trying to make everything fast so that we can meet up with the 45 seconds per question, you just need to show a decrease in supply, which is a leftward shift. And if it comes this way, to drag this to this point, E2 will give us this and give us this. So this is an increase in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity, because this will be QE2. What answer is corresponding to that? Option A says an increase in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. That's your best answer. You don't need to move further because it's showing from the diagram that this is your answer. So A is correct. B can be your answer, C can be your answer, D can be your answer, because we can't have two answers in one question. A decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity is not what we have, looking at the arrows. So that makes it wrong. A decrease in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, the two of them don't have decrease, makes it wrong, because we have increase, decrease. An increase in equilibrium price and quantity, no. The two of them don't have increase. This is also wrong. So for any question like this, your correct answer is option A, an increase in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity. Just the same way we have it on the diagram. Okay. Here we have a similar question that can also fall into this subtopic, effect of changes in demand and supply on equilibrium price and quantity. Now we have a price line here and then a quantity in units, don't forget. But then this question says, what is the new equilibrium point? And over time treating this topic, we have always told you that when you have an old equilibrium demand curve and a new supply curve, they can make up the new equilibrium points. So it is the latest demand and supply curve that makes up the new equilibrium point. The latest demand curve here is D2. The latest here is S2. So it means this is the old one, this is the new one. Old, new. You trace the two of them, their point of intersection is at E2. That makes option D correct. Option A is wrong because it's a combination of the new demand curve and the old supply curve. It won't give us the new equilibrium point. Option B is wrong because it is E1 and that's old demand curve and the new supply curve. Option C is also wrong because it's E4 and that's old demand curve and old supply curve, but the examiner says new. That makes it correct. Option D is right. With this, we have come to the end of the subtopic in economics called effect of changes in demand and supply on the equilibrium price and quantity. Don't forget to click on the like button, subscribe, turn on your notification, and also leave a comment. Thank you very much.